Read all that. Actually, what I'm going to do is, to begin this morning, is read the first 3 verses of the 24th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew. So if you would stand with me as we read those 3 verses together, we begin in that way. Jesus left the temple, and he was walking away when his disciples came up to him to call his attention to its buildings. So they were focused on the buildings and the architecture and the structure and all that was a part of that. Do you see all these things? Referring to the buildings, Jesus was actually asking. He said, do you see all these things? He asked, I tell you the truth, not one stone here will be left on another. Every one will be thrown down. As Jesus was sitting on the Mount of Olives, the disciples came to him privately. Tell us, they said, when will this happen? And what will be the sign of your coming and of the end of the age? You may be seated. I don't know if you've heard it for a while, but I have. Every time that things get tense in society, especially, or natural disasters happen, or anything like that, people come up to me and they say, I think it's getting close, isn't it? Or when we see the moral decay in our country and in the world, people come up to me and they say, I don't know how it could be much longer. I think the Lord's going to come right away. And so people ask those questions. You have asked those questions and made those statements, and people have asked you things like that. Well, this morning, I'm going to talk about when the world is going to end. When will the world end? And I think we have a definitive statement here in the 24th and 25th chapters of the book of Matthew. But I want to tell you this before we get started. Do you understand that in every age since Jesus walked the earth, people have been making those statements? Did you know that? For over 2,000 years, people have been asking, when's the world going to end? And people have also made predictions as to when the world is going to end. I had copied off some things here, and it says, end of the world, the top 10 doomsday predictions that didn't come true. And this covers over the last 2,000 years. And I'm not going to go through all 10 of them, but I'm going to read some of them for you this morning. One of them was way back in 77 A.D. Mount Vesuvius buries Pompeii. The infamous Italian volcano has erupted more than 50 times, don't know if you knew that, over its hundreds of years of activity. But no eruption was more earth-shattering than the one that engulfed Pompeii in the year 79 A.D. Well, the deluge of volcanic ash shrouded the city in a darkness like the black of closed and unlighted rooms, according to one witness, echoing the predictions of Roman philosopher Seneca that the earth would go up in smoke, according to a story that appeared in National Geographic. So the philosopher Seneca had been predicting that the world was going to end, and when Mount Vesuvius erupted in 79 A.D., they thought, this is it. It wasn't. The plagues and the fires of 1666, according, of course, to the book of Revelation, the number 666 is described as the mark of the beast, which put Christian Europeans into a tizzy, it says, as the year 1666 approached. The 1599 plague that ravaged Europe didn't help matters too much either, because when they saw the plague of 1599, they said the end is near. Then on September the 2nd, 1666, a fire started in a London bakery, destroying more than 1,300 buildings and tens of thousands of homes over the course of 3 days in London, England. Well, that's what Time reported. However, the disastrous fire claimed only 10 lives. They said the work of the devil, maybe. But it wasn't exactly the end of the world, which many thought at that time, as they looked ahead to 1666 as the last year on Earth. Halley's Comet in 1910 brought about another story that predicted the end of the world. The arrival of Halley's Comet, named after the British astronomer Edmund Halley, wound the Earth every 75 years or so. However, 1910's arrival of the brilliant star caused more panic than excitement, as many speculated that the comet's tail contained a gas that would impregnate the atmosphere and possibly snuff out all life on the planet. And so they were looking forward to that in fear and trembling. 1910 was the year. 1910 wasn't the year. We're still here. Well, there was, back in 1997, more recently, Heaven's Gate. Maybe you remember the story. A cult founded by Marshall Applewhite believed that the earth was going to be wiped clean by aliens. He might have been. It was going to be wiped clean by aliens, and that a UFO riding the tail of the Hale-Bopp comet would transport their souls to the next life, the Daily Mail reported. Their doomsday predictions turned tragic when 39 members of the sect committed mass suicide on March 26, 1997 in an upscale mansion in San Diego, California. It was one of the worst mass suicides in America's history. They just knew that was the end. It wasn't. Well, more recently, radio preacher Harold Camping was the latest figure to predict Judgment Day, which he was expecting, you remember, on May 21st, 2011. Based on his application of numerology to readings of the Bible according to National Geographic. The 89-year-old retired civil engineer had broadcast his doomsday warning around the world, even dispatching his disciples to spread the word. Though millions waited with bated breath, not me, Jesus did not come to collect the faithful, as Camping had said. You know, we could add to this list hundreds of predictions. People through 2,000 years predicting the end of the world because apparently they had some information that Jesus himself did not have. Well, that also was the question of the disciples. After Jesus had made his observations here as we begin chapter 24 of the Gospel of Matthew. And it's been a preoccupation of mankind for over 2,000 years. On the disciples' minds, though, following Jesus' statements here in these first 3 verses of Matthew 24, on their minds was a need for answers to what Jesus had just said. Do you remember he said, not one stone is going to be left intact. So in response to verse 2, they ask 3 questions in verse 3 a few minutes later. 2 of the questions sort of go together. And then Jesus responds in the balance of chapter 24 and also throughout most of Matthew 25. Jesus responds to these questions. First, he responds regarding God's judgment of Israel, or the Jews. But the end is not yet. He says through the intervening verses, following the first 3 verses. But the end is not yet. One thing, Israel's judgment was going to be preceded by signs. Notice beginning in verse 5 of chapter 24, we're going to read a lot of these verses this morning as we go through here. In verse 5, for many will come in my name, claiming, I am the Christ, and will deceive many. You will hear of wars and rumors of wars, but see to it that you are not alarmed. Such things must happen, but the end is still to come. Nation will rise against nation, and kingdom against kingdom. There will be famines and earthquakes in various places. All these are the beginning of birth pains. Israel's judgment, because I think Jesus responds to their questions in chronological order. They ask 2 or 3 questions. I think then Jesus responds to those 2 or 3 questions in order throughout these 2 chapters. Sounds logical to me, doesn't it to you? How that Jesus responded to their questions. Israel's judgment would be preceded by signs. There would be false Christs that would come. There would also be wars that would take place and national struggle. There would be famines and earthquakes and persecution and apostasy, false prophets, and there would be the increase in wickedness worldwide. They would see that taking place. But you be faithful.
Amen.
Josephus, writing about the 1st century, he was an early historian, tells about many false messianic figures that rose up within the 1st century. There was also missionary activity and persecution, yes, in the 1st century. Some converts reverted back to paganism, thus the New Testament letters of Paul and others. But the end, though, was not yet. You remember that Paul, as he would write to the Ephesians, or especially the Galatians, or many of the others, especially the Corinthians also in those 2 letters, as they struggled with 13 or 15 different problems, Paul was writing to call them back to faithfulness in Christ. Thus, the New Testament letters. Israel's judgment would be preceded by signs. Israel's judgment would also be an abomination. You remember back in the Old Testament book of Daniel, in 3 different chapters in the book of Daniel, he talks about them someday seeing the abomination of desolation standing in the holy place. Well, what they were concerned about in the Old Testament was the temple and their livelihood and everything that was going on, and the center of the temple in Jerusalem. And Daniel, 600 years previous to Christ, talks about the abomination of desolation coming and being there in the holy place. He had prophesied it. chapters 15, or verses 15 through 20 of Matthew 24, notice what he says. So when you see standing in the holy place the abomination that causes desolation spoken of through the prophet Daniel, let the reader understand. Jesus is saying there is still yet to come what was spoken of by Daniel 600 years previous. The abomination of desolation. And when you see that, then he goes on and tells them what they need to do and what they were going to do. He had prophesied it. Well, in AD 66, not long after the Gospel of Matthew was penned, in AD 66, priests were slaughtered in the temple area in Jerusalem. Thus human bloodshed desecrated, and Christians and Jews fled Jerusalem. And finally in AD 70, the Romans destroyed it with fire and then erected their own standards on the site. These standards for the insignia of the Roman emperor who was worshipped as divine, and that sealed the site's desecration. It was destroyed in 70 AD, the temple. Never again was all the pomp and the majesty and the worship and all of that. Did it ever take place again the way it had? Because it was destroyed. And Jesus had said, what? Not one stone will be upon another. There's coming that time, about 40 years after Jesus had prophesied it. Israel's judgment would be a tribulation, verses 21 through 31. In verse 21, he talks about what? He talks about great distress. False Christs and false prophets would appear. Do you remember Acts, the 5th chapter, in verses 33 through 37? As we go to that great chapter in the book of Acts, as he's telling about some of the early history, we find that Peter and the other apostles, they were in prison. They were brought before the Sanhedrin, and they were questioned, and they were thinking about putting them to death. And finally Gamaliel, a wise student of the law and history and observation of contemporary culture, he rose to his feet and he began to explain some things to them in that context. He stood up and he reminded them of two men who had claimed to be somebodies. It was common to have false Christs and prophets in the first century. They would do signs and miracles and other things. And Gamaliel, there still in the first century, reminds the others in the Sanhedrin of two such characters who had led people after them. They had been false prophets and messiahs. But the end of Jerusalem, your temple worship, is not yet. That's going to happen. And Israel's judgment would be within that generation. Do you see verses 34 and 35? I tell you the truth, this generation will certainly not pass away till all these things have happened. Heaven and earth will pass away, but my word, it won't pass away.
Amen.
Ever and ever. One thing we know for sure is that the temple, with its sacrifice and pageantry, never again arose after AD 70 when it was destroyed. So, as for the judgment of Israel, in response to the disciples' questions, all these things must take place. But the end is not yet. There were things to take place, signs before its destruction. in 70 AD, which is a historical fact. Well, Jesus went on to answer then another question. When will the world end? When will the world end? Regarding God's judgment on the world. How about it? Well, the end is not known. Israel's judgment is not yet. The world's end is not known. Remember, not yet. And remember, not known. Verses 35 through 41. The predictions we noted at the beginning of this message were all wrong, weren't they? And here, we don't know. Verses 35 through 41. No one knows about that day or hour, not even the angels in heaven, nor the Son, but only the Father. And then he goes on and he uses a number of illustrations. You see, the Noah illustration means we won't know when. Do you remember Noah? Well, you don't remember him, but back in the Old Testament, in chapters 6, 7, 8, 9, or 7, 8, 9, there in the Old Testament book of Genesis, it talks about Noah as somebody who apparently stood head and shoulders above his generation in righteousness and in godliness. And we find out in other places in the Bible that Noah preached to his generation for 100 years. You know how many converts he got? Not very many. There was he and his wife and his 3 sons and their wives, and that was it. For 100 years. And so Noah would go out and he would construct this boat, this giant boat that God had given him all the dimensions and all the instructions on putting that together. And so Noah went to work making a boat. Can you just imagine all the people going by and shaking their fingers at him and laughing at him and saying, Noah, it's never rained, and you've got the audacity to tell us it's going to rain. And the world is going to be flooded. And on it went. But Noah believed God. And he built a boat. Finally the day came. Oh, they didn't expect it. They didn't think it would happen. I mean, things went on like they always had. But finally the rains began to come. Boy, did they come. And Noah, his family, and all the animals got into the ark. And they were saved. It's like that. They didn't know until Noah entered the ark. Well, then he went on, and the thief illustration means we won't know when. Verse 43 and 44. Notice here he says, but understand this. If the owner of the house had known at what time of night the thief was coming, he would have kept watch and would not have let his house be broken into. If he would have just known. You know what the connection is? We don't know when the world's going to end. So you also must be ready, because the Son of Man will come in an hour when you do not expect him. Has anybody here ever been burglarized? Anybody ever broken into your house when you weren't around? I'll tell you what, it'll make a believer out of you. I remember one Christmas season, and we were in a parsonage at the time, and we were in Wanata, Indiana. And we had gone out for the night, and we did some Christmas shopping, and we were going to eat out and do some of that stuff. But you know what? I never left any lights on outside, and it was dark by 5:30, 6 o'clock, you know how it goes, something like that. We get home and we drive into the driveway, and I start downstairs. We lived in the tri-level, and I noticed the door was open. And my first inclination was, okay, one of my sons was the last one out, they didn't shut the door. And I got down there and I see this piece of molding laying on the floor, and I thought, uh-oh. And I saw a footprint on the door. Somebody had kicked it in, and so I told my family, get back in the car, we're not going in, we're going to a neighbor's. And that's what we did, because you never know what might be lurking around the corner. So that's what we did, but the way it makes you feel invaded and all of that, and if we would have only known that on that evening a thief was lurking in the neighborhood, we'd have never left, and we'd have had some lights on. But we didn't know. That's the way it's going to be. When Jesus leaves heaven, comes back to earth to claim His church, just like the thief that you wouldn't expect. Well, the servant illustration in verses 44 through 51 also tells us that we won't know when. So he talks about Noah, he talks about the thief, he talks about the servant, and in every one of those illustrations, really the punchline is, so you don't know. Then we turn the page to chapter 25, and he gives us some parables there. In chapter 25 is the parable of the 10 virgins. And you remember, 5 were wise and 5 were foolish, and 5 had their lamps burning. So when the cry went out that the bridegroom was here, then they were able to go out and meet the bridegroom, because they were watchful and they were ready for when he arrived. I don't know, we don't know much about Jewish weddings today. But back then, the bridegroom was notoriously late. He was notoriously late back in the first century, and you never knew exactly when he might come. Well, back then, they were to have their lamps trimmed and ready, and enough oil and all of that. And then when the cry went out that the bridegroom was on his way, then the maidens, or the bridesmaids, they would go out and meet him, and then they would escort him to his bride and escort him then to his house where the marriage would take place, and then they would go elsewhere and they would party. They would have a reception and do all of that. Well, this illustration says, the bridegroom's here. Get your lamps going. And you know what? They didn't have any oil. And it was too late. That illustration says, we don't know when, but be ready. The next illustration of the talents also says, be doing, be serving, be involved, be ready when He comes. The talents, we must ever be ready. Are we busy doing and ministering, serving when the Lord comes again for His church? Are we ready? And then, of course, there's the sheep and the goat illustration. I'm not going to read that one either. We're out of time. But it means also we must ever be ready when He comes and separates the sheep and the goats. One goes to His right and the other goes to His left when He comes again. Well, regarding God's judgment on the world, how about it? Well, the end is not known. But one thing we do know is be ready when it comes. when He comes. I'll never forget the illustration about John Wesley, that great revivalist, that great preacher who began a whole movement after his teachings and so forth, which is the Bible teachings. The story goes that John Wesley was out in his garden one day. He loved to garden. I think that's why I like John Wesley. But he was out there hoeing his garden, and he was pulling weeds, and he was doing this and that, and one of his neighbors came to the fence, and he looked at John, he hollered at him and said, "John," he said, if you knew that the Lord would come today, what would you do?" And John looked at him and he said, "I'd keep on hoeing my garden. I'd keep on hoeing my garden." Why? Because he was ready. He was ready. How about you? Would you just keep on hoeing your garden because you're ready whenever He comes? This morning we're going to sing a song of commitment and decision that's been selected for us today. I want us to